how do you stop being defensive in your relationships? That's our topic for today.
That's a good one. That requires self-awareness and introspection and brutal honesty.
That is an area of life that you have progressed beyond me. Brutal honesty. I would say I'm a very honest and authentic person, but you got me there. But I love this topic though. There's so much around like being defensive in relationships. We're going to break this down in like 10 steps. We're going to go through define defensiveness. What is defensive behavior? Because that's kind of like stuff that we overlook a lot. And then we have 8 specific steps in terms of like, how do we overcome this? How do we create a space for open and vulnerable conversation?
That's like 18 steps, man. You guys got to memorize. It's
2
like
plus
an
8.
exam. Oh, is it just 10? Okay, it's 10 steps.
10 steps.
10 steps.
Let's get into it though.
My name is Pi, and this is Dr. Glenn. We spent over 40 years researching relationship science as well as practicing in the space of clinical therapy. Relationships are the greatest source of meaning, joy, and success that we experience in life, but they're also the source of some of our greatest pains. We created TWR because in our moments of pain, we need better relationships in weeks, not years. We offer coaching, frameworks, and tools to do just that. Welcome to 12-Week Relationships.
All right, friends, welcome to the podcast. My name is Pi. I am a relationship coach, researcher, and educator.
I'm Dr. Glenn. I'm a department chair, professor, clinical psychologist, and author.
And all sorts of awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So our topic today is defensiveness, and I want to jump straight into kind of like defining it. But first, we got some notes to address.
Let's do it.
Our first note, a negative review. We got too much potty humor going on, man.
I read those reviews, and this is my take. And this is my honest take with no defensiveness, zero defensiveness. I get that people can be offended, right? However, if you look at the totality of what was shared, and if you're fixating only on the potty humor and then not the content,
yeah,
and the lack of, and the authenticity that's being shared in that space, and you can't appreciate that, then that's okay.
This might not be the right space for you.
This may not be the right space for you. And then honestly, with all due respect, you shouldn't watch the podcast because in my truth and working with clients, it's about being authentic. And I think instead of being offended, like when you're watching the last few podcasts, we're showing the work that's required. Like when I'm working with the clients, it's that level of directness and authenticity to get to a truth that is true for you. And not this bullshit, it's short-term mental stimulation, but it's the inner work that's required for you to make the best choices in your life, right? And that is what's being translated to me. No defensiveness. I get it. It could be offensive sometimes. But the point is, there's a level of truth and authenticity extends. And if you're offended by that, then again, I get it, but I'm not going to apologize for it. And again, you don't have to watch.
Yeah. There's, I agree with everything you said. And we both have like kind of different approaches to this, which is part of why we're doing this together. What's funny about this is like in our conversations, like not only is our work kind of reflected in our clients, but it's reflected in the relationship that you and I have with each other. Like we've kind of had to bring everything to the table and learn how to be authentic and openly communicate and to do this inside of a business partnership. So it's a direct reflection of that. But one thing I want to say is we created this entire platform to be authentic, to be different, to not be that clinical therapy space where you say and you present this version of yourself that's not really true to who you are, but it's the version that you're comfortable with other people judging and looking at. We're here to be open and to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation before, right? Like therapy, it's kind of this middle space, right? It's governed by insurance, right? Yeah. And then you can do like deeper dives in therapy, like trauma work and all those kind of things, right? But it's a lot of like talk type therapy, right?
Yeah.
Basic coaching is you have tools, you learn, it's kind of like a school, right? And we've gone to the point where it's kind of like advanced coaching, right? Because we've gone beyond the therapy model. Yeah. We go deep, but we also give you practical tools all at the same time, right? Yeah. So it's taking your mental and emotional capacities to another level. And again, that's being demonstrated. That level of authenticity is being shared, right? Even with the potty humor, it's the level of authenticity that's taking place, not, between us in the sessions, right? Let's be honest here, right? You've met other podcasters, right? And they can be fake on camera and look really, really warm and do the Captain Kirk and that, and I care about you. And then behind the scenes,
And stab you in the back.
they can be a backstabber.
Yeah.
They can be a real douche, right? I'm sorry for the potty humor, but they can present as summer breeze and smell nice, but deep down, they're not, right?
Yeah.
I feel like whether we're on camera, whether we're working with clients, this is what it is.
It is. I mean, there are moments like, I don't feel like what we're doing, sometimes we get a little bit deep into the potty humor, but we can dial that piece back. But in terms of like just being open and honest, when someone's a dick, they're a dick. Like there's no other way to say it. And we could be, indirect about it, but I don't feel like that is authentic to either of us. And so, yeah. And I kind of do love the fact that like you're the doctor that has 20 years of clinical therapy experience, that is a psychologist, a department chair, you're all of these things. And yet you bring it to the table like we're just talking, like regular people. And that's one of the things that our clients love. They mention that over and over and over again, how you're incredibly real.
Yeah, and I appreciate, and I think on both sides, right? Like you left, you're still doing work as a businessman, but you came and took your passions, right? Because you're looking at your life, the divorce that happened, you want to pass information on to your kids. There's a level of authenticity with that. There's a level of vulnerability and care. And then for me too, right? I've been in the profession. I could do the lingo. I can hold that space, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so everything that we're doing, again, in the bigger context, is an authentic space, right? And if you can see it in that lens, and then you're like, okay, but this is a little bit offensive to me, like that has more credence to me. But if you're just fixating on, oh, this is so offensive to me, then I don't think you're really paying attention.
Yeah. Maybe
Maybe you're defensive and closed off. Maybe you need to watch this video and take the 10 steps that are going to be provided.
I think so. And I want to get right into this. There's one more note that I would like to clear. So we're going to just clear we read, by the way, all of your guys' comments. So if you guys are watching videos, if you guys are on the podcast, post your comments, give us your thoughts. We will share what we think on things. And one of the other things that was shared was like, there's all these comments of this co-host is it's not this co-host. It's this interviewer is very annoying. I think it's people that will probably only watch like maybe one episode or something. I am not the interviewer here. If you go and watch, there are 90 plus episodes.
We're sharing content. Like we're partners in this thing together.
Yes,
yeah.
We are co-hosts. I am a researcher. I have 20 years of practical experience in the space of relationships, and I'm also an online educator. So if I share ideas, it's not coming out of my ass.
Oh,
I just want them to realize.
Look at you getting real. The potty humor is coming out on this side too.
Hey, that's not potty humor. Cursing is not potty humor. Burp and fart. Potty humor.
I thought that was a great analogy.
I thought it was.
If you are defensive and people are like contempt, like they feel contempt towards you, and you're not recognizing it,
yeah,
dude, you stink.
You do.
I'm
stink.
sorry, you smell, man.
That is the premise of it. Right?
That's the analogy there. And again, we didn't just make burp and fart jokes for 35 or 40 minutes. There's a lot of content there. I thought there was meaningful content there.
There is. We won't beat this dead horse. You guys know we've addressed it. Let's go straight into this, have an authentic conversation around defensiveness. And first, I guess step number one is let's define it. What is defensiveness?
So in simplistic terms, we all have wounds in our life, right? Mm-hmm. From our upbringings, from the things that happen to us. And then we try not to feel those pains again, right? Mm-hmm. So defensiveness is this mental construct that you display to the world. You want to be seen a certain way in hopes that your wounds don't get exposed so that you do not get hurt.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, like if you're a person like, I've been hurt, or I'm kind of dependent, but then you present yourself as a very independent person on the outside, eventually over time, it's going to get exposed, right? And this is where a lot of like frustration in relationships actually take place.
Absolutely. One of the things that when I think of defensiveness, it's that, like you described, this emotional wall that we essentially put up to protect ourselves. And in doing so, we think that we're exuding strength, but everybody else recognizes it for what it is. I mean, at least those that are emotionally aware, they can see straight through it to your insecurities.
Well, this is how it goes, right? So again, it doesn't mean that there's not truth to it, right? You can present yourself at an emotional distance, but the more intimate you get, the more people's weirdness comes out, right? And your wounds come out, right? And then if you're the person that you're with this individual and you're like, okay, I'm a very independent person, they believe you. But then all of a sudden, like the dependency starts to come out. There's a disconnect because now they're seeing two different versions, mm-hmm. right? And then people internalize it as, oh, there's something wrong with me, or I got to be more confident versus, it's hard to read you because what you presented doesn't match what's happening emotionally as we're connecting.
Yeah.
And that is pushing people away.
Yeah.
Right. And that is what defensiveness, again, on a superficial level can help. But then on a more intimate level, it pushes people away.
I love the way that you've put that entire thing. So why don't kind of step 2, let's go into actually identifying what defensiveness looks like in a relationship, because it looks like a lot of different things. So you want to start from the top?
I mean, I think it's emotionally closing off.
Yeah, there's the denial of responsibility.
Yeah. It's blaming other people when in truth, it's really a you problem.
Yeah. Making excuses for your behavior.
Making excuses, being defensive or argumentative.
Yeah. Or even going kind of on the attack, right? Like you say something about me and I'm like, yeah, but you do this.
Yeah, yeah. But let's define what that means though. The reason it's defensive is, what are you defending? So like, again, a defensive person, if I'm presenting myself as a very independent person, but then my emotional needy side is coming out, but I'm defending that I'm independent, you're trying to cover up and push your feelings down.
Yeah.
And you're creating a false reality to this individual. You're presenting a reality that's really not true, right? And that's what's causing a disconnect, because when people do that, you can feel it. It doesn't feel good. This doesn't match what you're saying, man. It doesn't feel good. And that's, again, this is starting to push people away.
Well, and I love that definition that you put forward, because from that definition, you can actually be defensive without ever having a conversation with somebody.
Exactly.
You know, the entire idea, and one of the things that I really dislike and I kind of try to educate my kids around is this bad bitch vibes, like this air of like, I'm this so awesome and I'm this and I'm. You can see it everywhere across social media. And to me, it screams insecurity. It screams defensiveness without even having a conversation with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if it's over exaggerated or you're overcompensating for something, it kind of shows, right? Versus like genuine people that are genuinely confident, they believe in themselves. It shows.
Yeah.
It shows.
So in short, if you want to identify defensiveness in our behavior, what we're looking at is basically any behavior that puts up a wall, that basically says, you can't know any more about me than what is already there. And this is where I'm going to put in this hard boundary, and I'm not going to accept any ownership, any responsibility, anything that could potentially damage my own self-esteem or my own self-image.
Yeah, correct. So again, it's like you had your wounds, and then to overcompensate, you're going to create a mental construct of yourself that you're going to present to the world. It has some truth, but it's going to falter and break down as you get more intimate in your relationships. And what do most people do? Doesn't work out, so they double down on trying to be more independent, and then more of their insecurities come out, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Again, defensiveness works to a certain point, but once it starts to get more intimate, it's not gonna work at all.
Yeah, there's kind of that line there, right, between like a boundary where like, but you generally implement boundaries in terms of like, the more boundaries we need, the less intimate a relationship is, right? So we have lots of boundaries, and those can be healthy measures of like defensiveness. But then you have within close relationships, the defensiveness that's not a boundary. It's just an unwillingness to see oneself, to see their own behavior in the relationship.
Correct. And it's not treating one thing as the same. There's emotion, there's like intellectual intelligence, skill building, knowledge, and then there's emotional intelligence, knowing yourself.
Yeah.
Knowing your wounds, knowing your healthy side, emotionally, what those things look like. That is where real strength comes into play.
I think this piece is definitely worth kind of pointing out, right? Because I often feel like people's boundaries get confused. Like boundaries and defensiveness are not one and the same thing. Like, but people will treat them that way. Like they might say, like, if we were having an argument, if we're having a conversation, you might say that, like, you know what, this is my boundary. I'm not going to have this conversation with you. I'm not going to go to this place. That's if we have an intimate relationship, that is not a boundary. That is a defensive wall that you're putting up. A boundary is something that is generally healthy, something that like kind of puts a fence, a border in a relationship to define like what you're willing and not willing to do. But if we're talking about a situation where I'm wrong in something and I go, you know what, this is my boundaries, I'm not going to talk about this stuff. No, I'm wrong. That is being defensive. It is not a boundary. And I think those things often can be confused and mixed with each other.
No, I agree. And again, it can be subtle sometimes, right? But a boundary means this, right? The more intimate you get into a relationship, right? So again, using that example, okay, I'm the defensive person. So I'm portraying myself as an independent person, but I'm very needy emotionally, right? And then we start getting closer, and then you're seeing the neediness come out, and then you're pointing it out to me, and I'm arguing to you, no, I'm this independent person, right? because now we're getting closer together. You setting the boundary means that as we're getting more intimate and my weirdness is being transferred onto you, you're like, this isn't working for me. You're not owning it. So you're pushing me away from that intimate space and you're finding the actual space where we can be cordial and just be normal with each other. That is what a boundary means. The other example is just shutting someone off. That's an example of just like being closed off yourself. But if you've made attempts, boundary, it can be the furthest distance. It's just the appropriate space where you can have a somewhat normal relationship with that person. And that's, you're pushing them out of that intimate space. That's what it actually means.
I love it. So let's get on to kind of the 8 steps then. Like, how do you change defensiveness in a relationship? We'll start with number 1. So number 1 of our 8, which is going to compile to 10. Cultivate self-awareness.
You got to know who you are. Mm-hmm. And again, it's separating the mental construct versus your emotional life. We have a lot of successful people that we work with. They're very successful in life, but then in their interpersonal lives, it's a hot mess, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason is because emotional intelligence is separate, right? You have to develop that level of yourself, like your wounded self, your healthy self, right? Just like it's a skill building that you need to develop, just like you do intellectually, learning skills, learning knowledge. Same thing from that emotional level. And that requires a deep level of self-awareness.
Yeah, there can almost be like, when you look at successful individuals, there can almost be a benefit to your lack of self-awareness in a lot of instances. Like if you're talking about somebody who is very career driven, you're talking about someone who wants to build a business, someone who just has a singular vision to do something, right? Mm. The lack of self-awareness can actually be helpful in that process because they don't pay attention to what other people say. Mm-hmm. They're not empathetic. Correct. They're just kind of singularly focused on this vision. And so they can be incredibly successful in this route because they can just follow this thing to the nth degree, regardless of what anyone says. And then into their interpersonal relationships, it's a complete train wreck.
It causes a lot of damage, right? And this is the thing that happens with a lot of our clients is they're so successful. They've achieved everything that the world considers success. But then in their relationships and with themselves, their wounds, no matter how much external success they have, it didn't take away the pain. Mm-hmm. It didn't take away the suffering. It didn't take away the damage that they're transferring onto the people that they care about the most. Again, that's a crucial part of a person's life.
Yeah. So if you're ever asking, like, can someone change in this area? Or when will my spouse or my partner, when will this person be less defensive? When will they recognize? What you're really looking at is, can they be self-aware? That's your marker.
Yeah. And then owning their vulnerabilities coming out. Like, yeah, I get it. You're accomplished, but right now in this relationship, you're kind of needy.
Yeah.
Or you're kind of being unreasonable right now. And then taking ownership of that. That helps a lot. That's how healing is done. Mm-hmm.
There's so I want to go on to kind of step 2 of this, and it ties back to this cultivating of self-awareness. So step 2 is practicing mindfulness. What is helpful in these moments, if you want to cultivate your own self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. We can't control other people, but we can think of ourselves. In moments where you might feel like you're moving towards being defensive, there are actual kind of signs, like physical signs. Mm-hmm. Like you might feel like your heart rate elevating. You might feel your stomach tensing and getting knots. You might be thinking of like the counter argument, like this person's still talking. You're like, oh, I'm ready to like throw this back in their face. These are the areas where we can begin kind of practicing mindfulness and going, oh, you know what? I'm actually moving towards that defensive space and become more self-aware.
This is how, this is my more practical version of mindfulness. Like why people are defensive? It's not because that they're bad people. Mm-hmm. It's they've had really bad experiences in their life and then they try to act normal about it. And they just try to continue on, which is great to a certain point, but it downplays, they're diminishing the pain and the suffering that they went through, right? So mindfulness would be like, you know what? This isn't working and my relationships aren't working because the wounds that I went through, they were worse than what I ever thought they could be. And they're bleeding in, right? So that level of mindfulness and awareness, and that doesn't negate your successes and who you are as a person. But once you get into that space and you start honoring your feelings, then you'll naturally start honoring the feelings of other people too.
That's incredibly difficult to do because society doesn't teach us to think that way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They teach us to kind of bury it, like I remember over our conversations and kind of developing our relationship, I've said multiple times, kind of like in a joke, like I go to my basement. And one time you asked what that really meant, right? And I was like, well, I grew up kind of alone in my basement as a single child. And that's the place that I always went to whenever I was scared, when I was like, that is literally where so in my head, anytime something threatens or presents a challenge, I go to my basement, but it's in my head now. The basement is the place where I disconnect from everything and just go back to that space where I feel comfortable. But what you're essentially saying is like, it requires us to do exactly what, everybody tells us not to do. Like the common wisdom is just, tough it out.
But
Walk it off.
But remember when we first met and you're talking about like, how you hated like, you still do like the the relationship industry and couples therapy, and you had there, we showed the research.
I hate the unhealthy aspects of it. The research. Absolutely.
But you know what like got me, and I'm like, yeah, I really want to work with you, is because when you shared your pain, right?
Yeah.
I remember you were sharing about like your wife, and then even the therapist was like, well, you should listen more, you should do this, and they try to normalize the experience versus when you were so frustrated, I'm trying my best, I'm overextending myself, I'm doing this. And then what do they tell you? Oh, Pi, you're being irrational.
Yeah.
Your feelings don't have
I was being gaslit by the goddamn therapist.
You have your feelings have no validity, right?
Yes.
It's the opposite. Those are valid ass feelings. And you had to make not incremental changes, but you had to make big changes.
Yeah, massive shifts.
And you did, because you honored your feelings, right? Because if you finally honored how bad the situation was, right?
Yeah.
That's where the defensiveness went away. And that's what I'm saying. When your people are defensive, it's not because they're bad people. They're downplaying how much pain that they're actually in.
Yeah. That's a beautiful take on mindfulness. So actually moving towards that space and recognizing, as opposed to like the typical, like just tough it out, just walk it off, just, bury it. You're stronger than your past. Like, of course you're stronger than your past. That doesn't mean that it's not worth recognizing those things, because
how bad it was.
Yeah.
Like it was still bad, man. And then giving yourself credit for all that you've accomplished. But yet, you know what? I could still see how this is bleeding through.
Absolutely. Okay, so step number 3 is, in a moment where we are feeling like we're moving towards defensiveness, is to remind yourself to practice active listening. And what active listening is not is thinking about the next thing you want to say, thinking about how wrong you are in presenting that idea, thinking about all the things that I could do to show you why that is incorrect. That is not active listening.
Yeah, like instead of trying to prove you wrong, it's about, okay, I don't agree, but I want to see this person's point of view.
Yeah.
That's active listening.
And it's difficult, because active listening requires that you listen despite maybe disagreeing with what that person's saying.
Yeah. And again, when people are defensive, they assume that their anger is connecting. It's not. It's a wall, right? Versus like, I'm hurting because this really hurt me. That's connecting, right? So it's being able to separate the two.
Yeah. One of the things that I really like to use personally in terms of moments of like active listening, and especially like the feelings of maybe being triggered, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but it's to remind yourself that when you move towards defensiveness, what we're really talking about is like this instinctual response to protect yourself, right? This kind of intrinsic, like, just lower brain response to like a moment where we might be in a life or death scenario. But life today is not that. Most cases are not going to be life or death, and they don't require this level of like defensive response or this triggered response. So one of the things that kind of helps me is to remind myself, like, look, if this is not a life or death type moment, then I don't need a life or death level response to it.
Absolutely, right? And if you feel that life or death response, instead of, oh, this is irrational, a pain is coming out, and it's honoring those feelings and using that so that you can heal.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that too, because that's a beautiful part in your process. Okay, so number 4, which I'm going to add an asterisk to this, but it's using I statements. You want to explain this piece?
Yeah, so it comes from like, communication skills. It's very typical in traditional counseling.
Yeah.
And it is effective. Don't get me wrong. Like, I feel hurt, or I feel angry, or when this happened, instead of you made me feel this way, you did this to me. Yeah. This is my interpretation of what happened. I'm angry about it. I'm hurt about it. I'm upset about it. That's a healthy boundary, because you're taking ownership of your feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. My asterisk is that it is an effective tool. It is just one of many different tools that we have to incorporate. So,
but it's not the be all end all.
Yes.
So if you have resentment underneath and you're pretending just to do I statements over and over, like we've seen that so many times, right? It just goes nowhere, and it doesn't work.
It almost becomes, I don't know why, but in a lot of cases when you go to therapy or counseling and you're talking about relationships, the I statement is used as if it's like this magic, solution to everything. And it's like, no, this is just one simple tool. But an example of it would be like, if you hurt me about something, like you said, I feel hurt, and we're going to add another piece to this. So if we go to number 5, it's focusing on the facts.
Yeah.
So we're not only not blaming the other person, it's not you made me feel this way, it's I feel this way. But then step 5 is focusing on the facts of the situation. So the right way is I and then when, right? I feel this way when you do this. And it's not about labeling you and saying like you're just a prick. Like when you forget to call me at night, you're being an asshole. It's completely insensitive. Like how could you do stuff like that? It's more like, and to flip it, it's when you forget to call me at night, I feel like I'm not a priority in your life. It's actually using that moment to present the fact and then to state how that affects me personally.
Yeah, it's so funny because we had a couple that I was working with, and then using the I statements, same example, like you didn't call me when you came home late, and I was upset because you didn't call and you came home late. So I was really upset and worried, right? It was, I feel upset because you were being a dumbass and you didn't even have the wherewithal to have care for me, and therefore I felt really angry and resentful. Like it's just kind of weaponizing it, right? So people can kind of twist those kind of healthy coping skills.
But focusing on the facts, using I and when, that can be a very helpful tool in these moments for sure. Okay, so if we were to go on, we have, I believe this is number 6. Number 7, because we have our total list, right?
Yes.
Anthony's going to figure out how to, edit this so it's like the correct numbers for each one. There was 10, but now we're on number 7, and we skipped a few somewhere. So number 7 though is to take responsibility. So if I made a mistake, I have to take ownership and responsibility in that moment.
But I want people to redefine what taking ownership means, right? Because one time people will be like, you know what, something is wrong with me. Oh, I'm just bad, or they'll label themselves as bad. It's not. The truth is, again, if you have a version of yourself, it doesn't mean that it's not true, but then it dwindles away when you start getting more intimate in your relationships, right? So it's owning like, you know what, maybe my pathologies are worse than I thought. And maybe I need to validate those experiences and own how it's bleeding out. Now you're showing self-love to yourself, and you're giving yourself the understanding it actually needs. You're not trying to normalize something that actually it wasn't normal, and it's hurting you and it's hurting your relationships. Give it that respect.
Yes. And there are, like, on a practical side, right? I agree with you 1,000%. On a practical side, in that moment of a conversation where like you feel like you might be going towards defensiveness, or I feel like I might be going. So if I said to you, like, you know what? Like, I feel like even if I approached it in the wrong way, right? And I come to you and I say, I feel like you're being a dick. Like, you didn't call me, you didn't do this. And like, that's not cool. Like, there is a moment there still where you could potentially diffuse it all by simply acknowledging, by simply taking ownership over that.
Yeah. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm not going to say this person's name because he's a friend of mine, but we hung out. Like, me and like some college friends, we hung out. And, he doesn't have the most success with dating or women, right? But in his mind, he was like, I want you guys to know something. And we're like, yeah, okay. And he's
Here
like,
it comes.
I am not a player. And we're like, no. But in his mind, his version of himself, he had to present this version of himself because underneath, he was so insecure.
Yeah.
He feels uncomfortable. He has a hard time being vulnerable. But also, this individual had a very difficult childhood growing up. And he had a lot of wounds and suffering. And until the connection of, dude, instead of like, oh, it's her, or yeah, it didn't work out because they're weird, or I didn't like their job. It's finally, it's me because I had so much pain. I don't know how to deal with it when I start to feel feelings for other people.
Yeah.
And that was the shift for him because he started being emotionally honest.
Yeah. That changes the way his friends would interact with him, I would imagine as well. Like when you can actually acknowledge that changes the dynamic of everything. And that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah.
When there's ownership, when there's actual responsibility taken, it changes the dynamic in the situation. Even if you approach me in a way that's uncomfortable, that's not good communication.
Yeah.
And I say, you know what? You're right. I was kind of being a dick there.
Yeah.
Automatically, your defense is lower too, because I'm acknowledging this.
You're holding space.
Yes, we're holding space for like a mutual truth. Like, you're right.
Yeah. And like with the friend, like it was so shocking to him. He couldn't speak. And then finally, like he could relax. Like, oh, okay, you guys know. Yeah, we've known for a while, bro. It's okay. We still love you, man. Right. So again, it's that honest space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go to number 9. This one's a big piece from basically the work that you've done, also your book, but trauma triggered therapy. You've wrapped this kind of term up to, well, I'm going to let you define it.
Yeah. So trauma is like, in traditional psychotherapy, if you get too emotional and you can't rationalize it away, your emotions are considered irrational, right? Trauma trigger therapy says, no, actually, when you have emotions that you can't rationalize, like you're just being triggered by something, it's not irrational at all. It's your wounds coming out. These relationships, like a signpost that you can use to actually heal. And again, we tie it all together. It comes from the physiology. It comes from your nervous system. It comes from your attachment wounds. It comes from your coping skills of trying to normalize things. And it actually has credence and validation for you in terms of what you need to do in your relationships moving forward.
Yeah. I love the approach because it's incredibly empowering, right? As opposed to what do we often do when it comes to being triggered? We try to control external, like I'm going to change the way that you talk to me. I'm going to tell you that if you say this, then you're going to trigger me. If you do this, then this is going to happen. And I'm going to remove myself from situations, which does nothing. It actually makes it even worse. But instead, you're kind of using that trigger point as that road sign of like, no, that actually indicates personal work. And in my mind, the best way to know when you're like kind of triggered by a past wound, this past bruise that's just sensitive to the touch, is like when your reaction goes far beyond what the moment merits.
Exactly, right? Because it's like, man, nothing really bad happened, but I feel so strong. Again, that's your trauma trigger coming out. It's an opportunity to heal.
Yeah, opportunity to take ownership as well.
Take ownership. And then again, instead of, a lot of people externally, they seek intimacy, right? Connection and to be real. And then, I found the love of my life or whatever the case may be, right? But when you're owning your triggers, you're being so authentically emotional with yourself. Now you're opening yourself up to actually have honest and intimate relationships.
Yeah, totally. Okay, last step. You saw the numbers.
Seek feedback.
Seek feedback.
So listen to the feedback. And even if you don't agree, try to hear that person's perspective, because it's not about right or wrong as much as each person just wants to be understood.
Yeah.
And when there's understanding, the right or wrong or who's the moral authority, all that starts to go away. And it's just, we just both want to be accepted for who we are. Mm-hmm. Bottom line.
I have nothing to add, and I couldn't said it better. So I love it. This hopefully was insightful for everybody that is watching or listening to the podcast. And we'd love to know your thoughts. So if you guys are watching on YouTube, you guys can leave comments. As you can see, we read them and we will address things. But in the meantime, what we'd love is you guys can actually join the newsletter for 12-Week Relationships. It's each week we basically send out just nice tips and insights. They're handwritten messages from Dr. Glenn and myself. Well, if I'm honest, I'm usually
it's you're the one writing them, yeah.
But
it's from Pi.
They're from both of us. They're from both of our work, although I'm the one that's generally
writing the
them.
emails. Correct.
But yeah, inside of that, we also talk about like our programs. From time to time, we do enrollments and whatnot. And so, yeah, we'd love to see you guys inside of the newsletter. We promise only value, and hopefully we'll see you inside of our programs, whether it's a intensive or one-on-one coaching. You guys can find links for that as well in the description of the video. That's it for today.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Peace.
Take care.